Hello, welcome, happy May. This is month 3 of the wave pool block of the month. I also realized I forgot to put that on here, so I'm going to add some text. And we are going to get started. So, wave pool month 3. That is also gigantic. And we are going to make that a little smaller here. Wave pool month 3. Ta-da! Okay, so we're going to get started here. We are working on our wave pool month 3. You are going to be using pages 9 and 10 of your pattern. There are a couple tools that you may find useful for this month. First of all, if you haven't gotten your clearly perfect angles, this is going to be super helpful since you would have to draw lines on all of your squares otherwise. So if you don't have that, I would highly recommend it. You will also need trimmer A for your clearly slotted trimmers. This is what that looks like. Both of these are available on my Etsy shop. Now, if you don't have those, a Friction pen is also super helpful for you to be marking your diagonals on your squares. So, I'm doing well, Hard Made Easy. I need to figure out how to look at chat too. So today we are going to be using fabric F, which is this blue, seashell blue, fabric G, and fabric I. And then also you have some background. You have multiple different cuts of these. So because there's a lot of half square triangles and a lot of flying geese, I did pre-make some of the things that we are going to be using. So I'm going to demo at least one of every combination, but then I have some extras just in case, or rather, not really just in case, just to actually get the final blocks to sew together a little faster so you're not just watching me make all of the half square triangles or flying geese. So the first couple things, we are going to make one fabric F in background half square triangle. So we're going to make one of these, or one set. We are also going to be making a fabric I in background, which is, oh, sorry, it's this one, fabric I in background, like so. And then we are also going to be making a fabric G and fabric I. Half square triangles. So we have these 3 sets of half square triangles to make. We're going to make these with our clearly perfect angles. So instead of drawing a diagonal across, so if you don't have clearly perfect angles, take your ruler, draw diagonally across. So essentially I'm taking this ruler, going point to point and drawing my diagonal across. And then I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch off of either side to make a pair of half square triangles. So in this case, I'm going to take it over here. Hello. Hi, Deanna. Hi, Tessa. All right. So we're going to sew on either side of the half square or drawn line, or you're going to use your clearly perfect angles on your machine. Align it so you are drawing, or it's going to be sewing following the instructions on the clearly perfect angles. So as you're making this for your own quilt, it will tell you how many of these sets that you'll need with the fabric pairing. For this month, all of them end up being the same size, so it's not too terribly difficult. We're going to go ahead and snip these apart, and I'm going to sew the other side. So sorry, you can see one side is sewn. I'm going to go ahead and sew on the other side as well. The clearly perfect angles saves you all of the times that you have to mark a diagonal. So it's saving you on half square triangles, flying geese, stitch and flip corners, anything that you would normally draw a diagonal on your square, you no longer have to do that with your clearly perfect angles. Okay, so now that I've sewn on both sides of the diagonal, and pretend if you didn't have them, you drew a line and you sewed on both sides, I'm going to go ahead and take my ruler and cut it in half. Or cut it corner to corner, which is about 1/4 inch from my sewn line. Okay. And obviously there's many more of these that you're going to have to make. I'm just doing a demo of every combination. Follow the instructions for how many you're supposed to be making total for this month. And then I'm going to use my trimmer A. This is the trimmer A. I'm going to align my block with the appropriate size. The dotted line goes on your stitch line, and then you're going to cut both sides and the dog ears. What this does is it ends up making your half square triangles perfect every time. And it also means that you only have to cut 2 sides versus all 4 once your pieces are pressed, right? So if you're cutting prior to pressing, you're cutting your 2 sides plus your dog ears, versus after you press, you're cutting and trimming off all 4 sides. This gives you very quick and easy half square triangles that are perfect every time. Move this out of the way. I did make some extras of these, but what we're doing this month is we're going to make all of the foundational pieces first. I'm actually only making enough foundational pieces for 1 of each block. You will be making 3 different types of blocks or units for this month. So we make all of our foundational units, and then we do assembly of the 4 different blocks, or sorry, 3 different blocks. So once we are done trimming, we have one more last one to do. We'll take these to the iron to press. I typically like to press towards the darker fabric. However, you may end up with some clashing seams. And what I mean by clashing seams is that all the seams are then pressed to one direction, and then you're sewing over all 4 seams at a time versus the other way. What I would tell you is if you don't like seams clashing, that you would need to press all of your seams open. That would be the best thing to do. For me, with batik fabrics, I don't find it too terribly difficult for having clashing seams, so I'm just going to go ahead and press all of my seams to the blue fabric. But again, if you don't like that, or if you're using normal quilting cotton where it's going to be a little thicker or a little harder, absolutely press your seams open. Alright, so here are your different units. The first one was your fabric F HSTs. This one is your fabric I HSTs. And then this is fabric GI HST, or half square triangles. Alright, so you should have a stack of fabric F, fabric I, and fabric G/I HSTs. When you're all said and done, it tells you how many you need in the pattern. So I did make a couple extras for today that we're going to need. So here's my stack of half square triangles. Once these are done, I'm going to put them aside. And the next thing that we're going to be working on is a square and a square. So we're taking our largest fabric F square, and then we're going to take 4 of our small squares in background, and we're going to essentially sew on 2 opposite corners from diagonal to diagonal. Now, if you're not using clearly perfect angles, you're definitely going to want to draw your line. So what you would do, go corner to corner, and you're going to draw your line. For a square and a square, what you'll want to sew on, instead of sewing a 1/4 inch away like you were for your half square triangles, you're going to sew directly on this line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially have two of them, because this is the fastest way to do it. You can do one side at a time, which is typically how I write instructions, just to make it easier. But to me, a little bit faster. It doesn't really matter which way you do this, left or right, like these two, they just have to be opposite, and as long as you're not sewing across another line. So I can't really sew this one, then sew the next one immediately. I'm going to have to trim and press, but I can sew the diagonal before I cut, trim, and press. So I can sew these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go take this to the machine and sew on the drawn line. Okay? Now, when you're making square in a square or any stitch and flip corners, what you'll want to do is you'll want to press your corner out to double check that you are covering up the square that you are cutting off before you cut it off. So if you sewn this at a wrong diagonal or a goofy diagonal, you're not going to be able to see the square behind it, or you are seeing too much and then you need to adjust your seam. You should be ending up with the same square that you started with once you trim off this excess. So this looks pretty good. As I push that out, that looks pretty good. I'm going to double check this side. Same thing, once I iron that, my seams look good and my edges look good. So I'm going to go ahead and trim off the excess fabric. So 1/4 inch away from your sewn line. Like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and press those out. Okay. Then I'm going to go ahead and take my two other squares and I'm going to sew across the diagonal here to make this a square in a square. All right. So now that I've sewn those two squares on, we're going to do the same thing as before. We're going to double check, press the seam open and say, yep, that looks good. Same thing here. I look like I have a square and a square, and it's going to look pretty solid. Or pretty square, I guess. I just said squares a lot in that sentence. So I'm going to trim off that extra. But it's always really good to check that your diagonal seams are actually on the diagonal. If they were slightly off, your square is going to look a little wonky, and then you're going to have to trim it down. So if you are trimming this down or you're double checking or something like that, this size should be the exact same size as you started with that center square. So here we go. We have that. So we have our square and the square finish. You'd actually make as many of those as you need to in the pattern as well. The next step is flying geese. So we are making two different types of flying geese, where you have your mane and your main like triangle and your wings. So we have a white background plus these seashell wings. Okay. And then we also have a seashell triangle with white wings. And we're just going to make one of each in this case. And this is the same deal. If we were doing this without clearly perfect angles, we would go ahead and draw a line on the diagonal. We would do that on the right side or the left side. Doesn't matter what you want, but you're just going to make this as your shape. So you want to make sure your sew lines are coming in at a point. Not at a diagonal or a diagonal this way like a rhombus, but at a point. So we're just aligning them to one side, sewing across the diagonal. But before we can sew the other side on, we are going to need to trim off the excess and press, because the other line will intersect the line that we just sewn. Therefore, we need to actually finish off this piece. So again, like we did with the square and the square, anything with the stitch and flip corner, you are going to need to press this open first. Double check that your piece is still the same as the one below before you trim that off, and press with an iron. The reason why you want to like at least finger press it or press it with an iron first or do something to verify your piece is because once you do your trimming, it's like next to impossible to fix it if you are off at any point. It makes it really hard, you know? Like, you can't really sew together two pieces, you can't really like glue together two pieces you cut apart. You're gonna have to sew them together. All right, so we have those. Now we're gonna add our other square to the left side of my flying geese, and we're gonna sew in this diagonal to make the bigger triangle. Sewed that one very well, so we'll see when we do our test on our stitch and flip corner if I need to unpick and restitch. I think we're gonna have to unpick that one. So I kind of made a boo-boo here. I don't know if you can see. I went off onto the inside of that triangle, so my diagonal didn't really work. And now my diagonal, I can see fabric behind it. I'm gonna go ahead and unpick this seam and restitch it, because that, if I went ahead and cut this and trimmed it and not resewn this piece, my rectangle, my flying geese, would not be the appropriate size. It'd be too small, and my rectangle is not really a rectangle. So I'm gonna go ahead and unpick and resew. It's a little hard to see how far off I was, but it was significant, right? Like, I went off quite a bit, and I see the background. Once I did that test, I'm like, oh yeah, you can see what was supposed to be on there, or what was behind it that I was going to trim off. That's not good. I need to go ahead and re-sew this entire seam. Rotated the square a little bit too to see if that would help with the seam. That seems to be much better. And then I'm going to test the other side. The other side is a little small, but it's not too horribly off. I'm just going to keep it and trim these off. That one trimmed off a little goofy, but that's okay because that's the seam allowance. And press these. All right, so now we have multiple flying geese as well. So I made some extra flying geese so we have more pieces to pull from. I'm going to go ahead and put these away for now because I believe we're done with all of the extras. So we just have our pieces right now, okay? We're gonna start working on block assembly. And the first block we're making is a fairly easy one. We're gonna be making a row of 3 flying geese. So it's gonna be this version of the flying geese, which is the fabric F background flying geese. Right? And so we have 3 of them that we'll wanna sew stacked on top of each other this way. the best way to put this together, I like to essentially place them right sides together, but I like to sew, honestly, with the point this direction. So I know I'm supposed to be hitting that seam right where that two lines from the flying geese are there. That helps me say, okay, yep, I'm supposed to hit that right there, and that way my point for this flying geese isn't going to get lost. So I'm going to go ahead and sew that. So you have this really beautiful intersection point with the line that I just sewn and the two lines that were already there on that seam allowance. I'm going to go ahead and press my block. And what that does is, you see how my perfect flying geese point did not get chopped off. That's why I did it that way. And then I'm going to take another one that goes here. I'm going to go flip that down. And then we're going to go these right sides together. And I'm going to go ahead and sew my 1/4 inch seam across. I just find it easier than if I sewn it this direction. If I sewed this way, I have no idea what I'm supposed to be aiming for. And I sometimes would accidentally get that off. So I don't like sewing with the long side of the flying geese up, just because it makes it so I have no idea what I'm aiming for. Alright, so I'm going to press that block. And these 3 stacked flying geese is going to be month 3, block A. Okay? So this is block A, and we're going to be making 4 of these. So lots of flying geese, 4 of these blocks. Okay? The second thing that we're going to do is that we are going to sew 2 of these flying geese side by side. This is where I'm like, okay guys, if you are all pressing these out, and right now when I sew these together, I'm going to end up with clashing seams. All my seams are towards the wings. And that is okay. That is just fine. If you want it to go a different direction, you can definitely do that as well. You can go back and fix some of these. I am totally fine with everything going in one direction. Okay. So as you open this up, okay, not so good. I'm probably going to have to fix this, is that like I didn't line that right. That point is totally off. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that. That is the one problem with everything being on one side of the seam, is that you end up kind of like squishing the fabric over. This is something that if you are doing it this way, pinning also is super helpful on making sure that you don't end up with like a skewed seam like I just did. You can like feel where both of them should be hitting. Should be fine there. Okay, that's better. All right, where that seam lands together, I'm going to go ahead and press that. And you're going to be making 2 of these side-by-side flying geese, because this is going to go on the side of block B, and block B you make 2 of. Okay, so I'm going to set that aside for now. Now block B. I'm going to use a design board so we can bring this over to the machine. But block B is an interesting one. So we have our square and a square in the middle. We're going to use our Flying Geese, our background fabric F Flying Geese. Okay, so it's going to look like this. We're essentially making a star, right? Like, ta-da, star. Then we're going to use our other half square triangles and complete out this block. This whole block is using fabric F. All right. So now we have a grid. Okay. We have a grid. We have column 1, column 2, column 3. Pretty much what I tell you to do is sew the rows together. Like so this. So once you have the rows sewn together, you're going to sew the rows together in this direction to then make your block. I like to web piece. So what that means is I'm going to take column 2, sew it to column 1, or column 3 to column 2, column 1, yeah, whatever. We're going to essentially sew column 1 and 2 together, then column 2, like 1, 2, and 3 together. Once we have all of them sewn together, then we'll sew the long things, but we're not going to cut our thread in between each of them, if that makes sense. So on a block with a center column that's fatter than the rest, so if like, say like this was all the same size, I would start from column 1 and column 2. If it's fatter in the middle, I typically like having the fatter piece or the wider piece on the bed of my machine. So we're actually going to sew column 3 to column 2 first, cut it, then rotate everything, and then sew column 1 to column 2, 3. And the only reason why I do that is just because it's easier to sew a smaller piece to a bigger piece than the other way around. Okay. So I do not cut my thread at all in between any of this. So you can do these two things. You can go ahead and press these seams if you'd like to the direction that you would like to press them to. I'm going to do that just for show so you guys can see a little bit more clear how I'm going to go ahead and add the next one. And if you notice, none of these are cut. This is all one piece. They're all just kind of held together by chain piecing thread, like so. Now I'm going to rotate this whole piece around, and I'm going to sew this column to the two pieces I just sewed. I can do that because this piece is symmetrical and it's in a grid, but this is now was column 1. I'm going to sew that to 2 and 3. And again, I'm not cutting any of the thread in between the different rows. The way I have the thread kind of holding all the pieces together is what creates the web. And then that kind of helps not forget what direction all your pieces are supposed to go and the orientation and what they're supposed to sew next to, etc. So I have this full block somewhat sewn together, except I'm going to press that last bit that I just did. the block is sewn together, but it's not complete, right? Like all the rows are kind of sewn together, but the rows to each other haven't been sewn. So that's the next step. So I have all the rows sewn. Now my rows need to get sewn together. And the next thing I would say is if you are pressing your seams open, let me actually put it this way. We're going to fold these down and we're going to sew the 2 rows. But if you had pressed all your seams open versus to one side, web piecing means that you're going to need to go and snip your little threads if you're going to press the last seam open, just because you have your little thread hoops, that if you're pressing that seam open, you're going to have to cut. You'll see what I mean when you get there. So I'm going to go ahead and use some fork pins and pin my seams together where they're supposed to meet. And I'm going to sew this longer row together. Take the pins out, and I'm going to do that to the other side. Alright, so I'm going to take that other seam, pin those 2 together, and pin the other side. I do give you directions how to press, but again, if you don't like clashing seams, don't follow the instructions, because if you follow the instructions, you may end up with clashing seams. So there's the block, almost finished. I'm going to go ahead and press these. And in order to finish block B, we're going to take our 2 flying geese that are side by side, and we're going to sew that to one of the edges to finish off this block. So we have this, and then we have this block. We got to make sure that we put it in the right orientation, okay? So it makes this little thing with this side. So don't, if you place it this way, we're not making a square in a square. Let's just put it that way, right? Other direction. We're doing that. Okay? So now we're going to go ahead and sew these together. You got to kind of be a little bit gentle because there is no seams that nest in this case. So you'll want to be careful that you don't, start it too early or too late with this block. AKA, there's no place for you to pin, so be careful holding, or you got to pin arbitrarily for this block. And we're going to go ahead and press that. And voila, this is block B. So you're going to be making 2 of these. Okay? Make sense? Block B, block A. There's one other block in month 3 that you got to make. I'm going to take my design board again, and my block 3 is going to also be a gridded block. So we're going to be making this block as web pieced as well. So now we have our half square triangles left over, and we also have some white normal just squares, okay? So we're gonna start laying out this block. So these are on the corners of the 4. We have these here that are gonna look like so. Okay, so we do a little bit of a pinwheel in the middle. And then we do this little fun pinwheel this way. That way and that way. Then we have 4 white squares that go here. Now this web piecing, because all of these are the same size, right? All of these squares are similar. I'm going to start from column 1 and 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to start going column 1 and column 2. I'm going to sew column 1 and column 2 together, cut my thread at the end, add column 3 to what I just sewed, and then add column 4 to what I sewed. Now when I talk about pressing seams, you can press seams open, or you can press all of these to one side, all of these to the next side. So left and right. That's usually how I like to do some of these. Or, you could theoretically go, this is in, this is out, this is in. But really when you're web piecing a grid any larger than like 3 by 3, press all to the left, all to the right, all to the left, all to the right. That is the fastest way to do it, and the way that you won't actually like forget which direction are you supposed to press your seam. So when I take this to the machine, I'm going to take column 2, put it right sides together this way, and I'm going to sew with column 1 all the way down. Then I'm going to add column 3, add column 4. I'm going to finger press versus coming to the iron between every single row or every single column that I'm adding on. I find that to be faster and sufficient. I don't need to go to the iron. If you finger press large enough, you can do that. Thanks, Tessa. I agree. I like these blocks a lot. They're very exciting and very fun to do. And the basic shapes of all of these blocks are very similar. And so you're just making kind of fun things with some basic shapes. So this is column 1, column 2. Easy peasy, right? When I open this up to add column 3, I'm going to pick left or right to press my seam. I'm just going to alternate the direction that I'm pressing my seam with the next row. So if I press my seam to the right, the next row I'm going to press to the left, and vice versa, right? So that's kind of the thought process and the idea. I'm going to go ahead and start adding column 3. Since I pressed the first row seams to the right, I'm going to press this row to the left. Add my next piece. And as your half square triangles, if you press to one side as they start nesting, make sure to nest your seams. Again, press to the right. If I went right, left, now it's going to be right again. And press to the left. So I did right, left, right. Now I'm on left. So now I have columns 1 through 3 kind of sewn. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to open this one up. I like pressing my seams. If I press to the right for this first one, I'm going to press for the right for this first one, but for this row. So that means everything in that row is going to go all the way to the right. Everything on the next row goes all the way to the left. And that way it's just easier for me to remember. You theoretically can do right or left and just alternate by whatever it is, right? Like if I decided to go left on that one, I could easily gone left, and the next row I just go right, like determining which side I'm pressing my seams on, if that makes sense. But to me, I just find it easier to stay consistent with the rest of the row. So that's one goes left. I'm gonna go then sew this last one. And part of the reason why I say it's easier just to stay consistent is because once I take this to the iron for the last row, then I'll know it's always the same, right? Like for the first row, I started to the right, I'm going to press the first row to the right. You know, it just makes it a little bit more consistent, a little bit less for you to remember as you're making the block. Alright, so now I have all 4 columns sewn together. I'm going to go ahead to my iron and I'm going to go ahead and press now all the seams. Now, when we've only finger pressed the rest of them, you're going to have to remember you have to go back and just, you know, hit your finger press seams with the iron to really get them down. You don't really need to do much more than that because your finger pressing should be pretty accurate enough. Like you're not pushing on your seam, you're just, you know, making sure that they stay flat. So here's what the block looks like right now. Whoops, too far this way. All right, so this is what the block looks like right now. We are now going to start folding over the rows. So you're sewing row 1 and row 2 together. And hey, by the way, if you press your seams in opposite directions, these seams nest. And you'll use your fork pins to pin your seams and sew together. So I pin everywhere that seam nests. So you should have 3 pins. If they were like 1 inch apart, I may or may not pin. But because these are pretty big, I'm going to go ahead and pin those. Fork pins are great because you can sew over them as long as you don't hit the pin going like jackrabbit speed. So you'll hear me slow down as I approach a pin. And then speed back up after I've sewn past the pin. Okay. So now rows 1 and 2 are together. I'm going to go ahead and add row 3. And right now, if you notice, I'm not going to the iron to press rows 1 and 2. I can press the whole block at the end without having to go and press individual rows. The other thing is once you're done sewing all 3 seams, you essentially want to press all of the seams towards one direction. You don't need to, you know, alternate these seams in any sort of way. I would just pick, you know, top or bottom and press all of your seams in that way. Sometimes you'll see me lift up my piece like that. That's really just to make sure the bottom seam allowances are staying in the right direction and they didn't flip on you. All right, so now we have 3 of our rows sewn together and we just have this last one to add on. So I'm going to go ahead and fold that one over and pin our 3 seams where they meet. And sew these together. Seams in one direction. And then we are done with block C. For block C, you will end up making 4 of these as well. So as you can tell, we are making lots of blocks this month. 4 of block A, 2 of block B, and 4 of block C. And to be fair, block A is 3 flying geese. Like, that's not a ton of work, but once you get all of your half square triangles and your flying geese made, the block assemblies go together pretty quickly. Actually, I want to fix something real quick. I just realized in the middle, I'm like, my seams look fine, except for the fact that my middle is a little too loose. And I kind of lost my 1/4 inch seam just a hair while I was sewing through that middle section. So I'm going to go through and clean that up a little bit. Sometimes with a lot of fabric and a lot of seams, it gets a little goofy, and it's just, I had the seam in the right spot, I just went off the 1/4 inch seam. Like, it was pinned right, it looked right, I just went off the center. All right, so here is block C. Ta-da! So block C, we're making 4. Block B, we have 2. Block A, which is the flying geese, we also have 4. So that is how we are finishing up month 3. I hope everybody is enjoying this block of the month so far. I really love the finished quilt, and I hope you guys are enjoying the challenges and are having fun making this quilt. I will see you guys next month. So second Friday, the Saturday after the second Friday of the month, at 1:30, we'll be live again on YouTube for month 4. I will talk to you guys then. Thanks!